They opened Fortress Europe with a door that had no handle abeach. Omaha was not a place so much as a problem shingle, and surf and a wall of chalk and guns that required thousands of small keys turning at once. Tom Rowley, a combat engineer from the 29th Division, felt for his key in the dark of the Higgins boat, a Bangalore torpedo wrapped in oiled canvas sections, taped so they wouldn't chatter. He counted the teeth of that key the way some men count prayers. Beside him, Father Malloy's gloved hand rested on a canvas satchel of morphine and rosaries. He had learned that both worked best when the hand holding them did not shake. The coxswain, Joe Greeley, leaned into the tiller and watched the black water lift into gray. He had a boatswain's whistle tied inside his life jacket with a length of twine because he believed in luck that could be located by the fingers. They rode in as if approaching the stage of a rumor. Shells were supposed to have erased music from the bluff. The plan maps, with cheerful arrows, aerial photos that rendered fear in soft grayscale, promised a beach gentled by bombardment. Tom had stopped trusting promises the month the channel taught him the weight of a winter wave, but he let himself believe one polite sentence. The ramp will fall, we will run, the wire will break, and the road inland will begin as a line in the sand. He fingered the pencil stub tucked in his pocket next to a Hershey bar that had become a talisman against seasickness. The 29th were blue and gray Virginia, and Maryland stitched together boys who had grown into men among hedgerows they did not own yet. Somewhere behind them, destroyers were punching the dawn with muzzle flashes, and he told himself those flames were carpenters' saws cutting doors. Inside, Widerstand's Nest, 62. A concrete mouth cut into the bluff above Colleville. Obergefreiter Lukas Wittmann watched the sea write white scribbles around black dots that became boats. He had the face of a man who had learned to keep his eyes where his orders lived. In his breast pocket, a paper folded into eighths, his brother's pencil drawing of their orchard near Bremen, a pair of trees that leaned toward each other like old arguments refusing to end. The bunkers were supposed to be the shoreline's hard grammar. Fortress Europe, the radios called it, as if concrete could conjugate itself into always. The last week had taught him that concrete was only stone, with delusions of permanence. He let the periscope rest against his brow until the metal left a cold circle there. Then he looked down at the beach at the obstacles they had planted, in winter Belgian gates, hedgehogs, poles tipped with mines like malignant blossoms. Fate had been arranged in triangles. Between bunker and boat lived a village that had become a caution. Claire Bouchard, 17, had the run of a farmhouse at the edge of Vierville because her father had been taken to Germany the previous autumn, and her mother traded milk for news with a discipline born of hunger. Claire knew the color of German boots in mud and the sound of an American engine not built for lanes that had memorized hooves. In the barn, beneath a curtained hayloft, she kept a basket with a coil of phone wire and 2 knives, one for bread, one for courage. The night before, she had walked the bluff's path and noted a sign Menin whose arrow no longer pointed at the truth because she had turned it when nobody watched. It was a small cruelty, practical and pardonable. The sea ran out of patience. The last miles, flat as a page, stood up and slapped. Joe feathered the throttle and prayed a coarse sailor's prayer to no saint in particular that the ramps they were running toward would present their faces and not their edges. He had learned that the ocean was a comedian with poor timing. In his throat, salt and diesel and the remembered sweetness of a cheap cigarette he had promised his mother to quit. On the port bow, another LCVP disappeared in spray and came back with one side lower. The men in it swore like men who understood grammar best when it was shouted. They hit the sandbar wrong. The boat jolted, lifted, dropped again with the insulted thud of steel meeting a shelf that had been mismeasured by tide and assumption. 30 yards, Joe shouted. Far as you can, he meant. You will step into cold that eats the knees first, and God willing you will find your feet before the machine guns finish their introductions. Tom's hand closed on the Bangalore, and the pencil rolled into the boot of a boy whose name he had learned at 3 in the morning and already forgot. Father Malloy slipped the rosary into a breast pocket and put morphine under his tongue like a vow. The ramp fell. Sound came as a sheet, tearing canvas made of lead. Men stepped into water that taught them again how much a human weighs. The engineer Sergeant Hathaway, who had the calm competence of a man whose father ran a hardware store and who had sold nails for a living, once pointed with a gloved finger. Obstacles, get the tape on. Get them marked. Tom went forward because forward was the only direction that didn't feel like betrayal. He thought of the training film with its cheerful voiceover explaining how a pole mine detonates, and he decided he would think of other things. The smell of creosote fence posts, baking in Virginia, Son the brown dog that slept under his childhood porch the way his mother folded bread into his hand the day he left. Lukas let the first belt rip as carefully as if he were cutting a loaf. The tracer rhythm looked like accusation. He had been told these men would break and run and drown in their own fear. He watched them break and run and drown and go forward anyway, and he felt the little internal wrench that occurs when a story meets its contradiction and must either change or become cruelty. He changed nothing. He adjusted left 2 mills and cut another line. When the smoke lifted a little, he saw a priest in a helmet, a little man making an X in the air, and then dragging somebody by the webbing. He considered shooting the priest first, because that is what doctrine recommends, and could not make his finger consent. Destroyers off the beach stood in closer, because sometimes the only way to help a drowning man is to get into the same water. USS Doyle brought her bow in until the chart was a rumor, and the coxswains on the bridge could see the right-hand bluff in a painter's detail. Guns that had been designed for ships shot at doorways and embrasures. The first salvo walked the crest and found itself applauded by men who had been taught not to expect manners from artillery. On shore, Tom read the room the way carpenters rid studs in a wall. He saw where the fire thinned, where the sand spat less, where the wire hung lower, and he crawled there like a man who has borrowed his own life from an accountant who demands receipts. Claire watched the smoke write its foreign grammar. She listened for a note she had heard once in the parish hall, when men passing through tuned a guitar, the waver that means the string is almost true. The destroyers impossibly close gave her that note in iron. She made her way along the footpath toward the Vierville draw lane, whose hedges had privately decided they would rather be walls. A sign tilted pointed in the wrong direction. She left it. That, too, was a kind of shooting. On the sand, Tom found a hedgehog, the welded X of steel rails, and the tape men had trained to wrap around obstacles. White with red ticks was unraveling in a wind that confused duty with dance. He slapped the tape on and yelled bang, which meant not explosion, but tool. Bring me the sections we will feed, the snake under the wire, we will teach it to bite. A boy, maybe 19, maybe always, brought him the first section, with the seriousness of a man delivering a baby in the back of a car. They screwed the joints fast, the threads gritty with sand. Father Malloy slid beside them and patted Tom's shoulder, as if he were a parishioner about to confess. Make me a path, son. Yes, Father Tom said, because obedience is easier when it echoes something you loved. Up on the bluff, Lukas swiveled to hammer the place where the obstacle tape had appeared a bright dare, and his gun jammed with a sound he knew too well, the insult of mechanism refusing to be at war a moment longer. He cleared it with the practiced violence of a butcher knocking a joint into cooperation. In those seconds, the destroyer's salvo crossed the face of the cliff. Concrete that had been promised forever learned the grammar of dust. Lukas ducked under a beam and thought absurdly of the orchard of the summer wind nicking his eyes with pollen, and the thought made him feel like a thief. The Bangalore went in like a poem you can only read once. Tom pushed the long tube under the lowest strand hand over hand and lay flat and signaled with the smallest nod he had left. The boy with the fuse did his part with a delicacy that might have turned bread into design had the century given him other tools. They yelled and kissed the sand, and the line came up with a violence so clean it looked like truth. The gap was a human width. It needed enlarging. Everything does. Tom went to meet it. Training lied kindly, which is not the worst sin. In Devon lanes in the chalk of Dorset, men learned to run up beaches that answered back with blanks and instructors. The whole of England felt like a dress rehearsal conducted by an ocean with a good memory. Omaha was supposed to be the easier door. The plan said so. Bombers, missing the shoreline in fog and fear of friendly fire, had walked their loads inland and left the wires and stakes and mines as prim as when they were set. Naval shells had hurt the bluff the way warnings hurt stubbornness. In the last mile, currents had drifted men to sectors not printed on the cards, folded in their breast pockets. The orchestra began a symphony with woodwinds missing. Tom had learned to love one small lie because it helped that luck could be arranged by fussing the details. He greased threads. He spun couplings back that quarter turn that keeps them from binding when sand gets inside. He cut date cord clean, no ragged ends. He told the younger men that this was not courage, it was maintenance. He did not say out loud what the older engineers understood, that courage is a maintenance schedule you keep when every screw in the world insists on backing out. Joe, the coxswain, ran boats ashore with a gambler's grin he didn't feel. He had brought his men into a crowd of bullets and under orders brought another boatload 3 times because the channel did not accept IOUs only returns. He learned to read the surf the way a card sharp reads faces a tell wherever the foam curled differently around a gate, a trough where a hedgehog made the water remember iron. He spoke into the wind the way you speak to a dog that refuses to come because the yard smells like a cat. Come on. Come on now. He set the ramp into water just shallow enough that the men didn't vanish. He watched them go and did not count. Counting is a cruelty when the numbers won't add up to a debt you can pay. Father Malloy had revised his theology somewhere between Slapton Sands and this place that would request his voice for so many names. He carried last rites the way some men carry a canteen. He kneeled in water he could not bless into warmth and took a hand and said the Latin that did not argue with fear. For boys who were not Catholic, he learned to say other liturgies. We're here. Breathe with me. You are not alone. He stuffed morphine into other hands and taught them that courage injected is still courage. When he looked up, eyes stung with salt and cordite, he saw gaps appear and disappear like mouths that couldn't decide whether to scream or sing. Claire lit 3 small lies in the ruins of the seaside cafe. Her aunt had once run a kettle without tea because steam looks like comfort from far away. A cigarette in a chipped cup as a trick for any patrol that came looking for owners. A child's marble lodged under a door to make it refuse to close. She knew who owned the cafe, now the Germans did by decree. She also knew the cafe still owned itself. The chipped saucer had its own stubbornness. She waited for a shape she could meddle with that might matter. She listened to the guns and learned that even a fortress can't keep rhythm under that much metal. Up inside WN-62, Lukas worked a choreography of reload and fire and clear and cough. The section leader, a man with opinions about platoon tactics and the proper way to hold a spoon, had lost one ear to a fragment and bled like an argument. The bunker smelled of damp concrete and fear pressed flat to make room for duty. The periscope showed a beach whose colors argued khaki on gray on red on white water. He thought of a day in garrison when a corporal had taught him the names of American divisions from silhouettes. He found them here by gesture. Instead, men who kept going when visibly wrong men who stopped and did the right thing in the wrong place. Men who lay down and decided to remain. Some of them were praying. A few were laughing, which he found impossible. And then because the day had turned to scholars, out of everyone learned to accept. The destroyers moved in another 50 yards because competence is a species of disobedience. Captain Buster Hall on one ship ordered the helm over until a junior officer said, "Sir, that's shoal water," and Hall answered with the humor God designed to keep men alive, "Then we'll shoot faster." The next salvo reached out and tapped a machine gun nest into a suggestion. On the beach, Tom saw a sudden slack in a curtain of tracers and went to stand in it. It took a certain kind of arrogance to assume the universe had noticed your need and made room. Bangalore snakes became a syntax, a way of speaking to wire that believed it was inevitable. Tom pushed and lit and flattened. The shingle tried to resist because stones learn bad habits from centuries of tide. He found a rhythm breath on push breath, held on fuse breath, given to sand when the det cord bit. The men behind him, riflemen, whose doctrine said advance through cleared lanes, followed the fresh grammar like students who had at last heard a teacher they respected. A corporal clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Good road, Sarge," and Tom felt the brief, illicit pleasure of being called a rank he did not own. Joe beached again and again until beaching felt like memory. He saw a boat beside him take a hit and fold as if the ocean had decided to keep it. He turned away because turning toward would drown 36 men with him. He hated himself with an efficiency that might have been admirable in another profession. He lit the boat's little cigarette of a bow wave and lied to the men in the well soft as a baby's head. They knew he was lying and loved him for it. The ramp fell. A kid with freckles swore with the precision of a craftsman. You could build things with that precision. You could blow them up too. Father Malloy found a boy pressed behind a hedgehog, with his hands flat to the steel as if he were hiding his heat from the bullets. "Can't move, Father," the boy said. "You have to," Malloy said gently. "The water's coming up." He didn't mention the tide because mentioning the tide would be like telling a man about time when he was counting his breaths already. He took the boy's hand and gave him a choice disguised as an order. The boy agreed because in his own life he had obeyed his father when asked to carry wood, and this felt like that. They moved low, then lower. A ricochet smacked the hedgehog and sang like a fork on a glass. They lived. The first German counterorder arrived so late, it might as well have been poetry, hold fire. For armor don't waste bullets on boats, let the artillery earn its bread. Lukas obeyed by doing what he had been doing. He had never been asked to stop anything before, only to continue it more accurately. Above him, the concrete scraped a note as a shell licked the edge. Grit fell in his eyelashes. He thought again of the orchard and blinked the grit away and kept time with the belt. Down on the beach, a man with a camera crawled like a crab and pretended that the world could be explained by pictures. Claire made a decision the Vierville draw would either be a throat or a road. She went to where the hedges pinched, found the signpost that promised a direction to drivers who could not see, and wrenched it sideways another degree. A German messenger on a bicycle passed and waved, because in a village even the wrong people know each other. She waved back because manners were an armor of their own. Smoke shuffled the day's deck again. The sea kept playing its two notes. Push-pull. At E1 draw, where the shingle rose short of the bluff, a handful of men gathered because survival loves company. The destroyer's shells had shaved the crest here the way a barber cleans a neck. Tom lifted his head and did math without numbers. The fewest bullets, the least wire the men who would follow even if told not to. He signaled with a hand chopped horizontal. 2 engineers crawled to him like children whose knees had learned to love scabs. "We're keys," he said, and realized how ridiculous the word sounded in his teeth. "We're keys," one of them echoed, making it true by mocking it. They built a Bangalore long enough to make the wire reconsider its choices. The fuse burned like certainty. The beach decided to live or die in increments, no larger than the length of a man lying prone. In the first hour, increments were rare. In the second, they multiplied when men stopped trying to execute a plan and began instead to execute decisions. The first infantry squads, who made it through Tom's ribbons of explosion, learned that the sand behind the wire was not safer. It was simply a new kind of exposed. They lay in a ditch that had been designed by rain and waited for the moment when waiting was no longer an act of faith, but of negligence. Above them, the bluff offered steps if you knew the choreography of dirt. Joe brought the next boat until the tide told him no. He looked at his hands, at the way rope had blackened his palms, at the little line of blood where a splinter had insisted on joining the war. He turned the boat, took it back out, and found himself crying without the drama of sobs, the efficient leak of a machine that has developed a crack and can still get the job done. He wiped his face with his sleeve and laughed because he thought of his mother's apron and how ridiculous men look when they pretend aprons aren't armor. Father Malloy found a cluster of boys without an officer and decided that his collar counted for rank where bullets didn't read insignia well. When I say move, we move. 100 paces to the shingle, then the dune, then the gap. You'll see the tape. You won't be alone there. He did not tell them why they wouldn't be alone, because bodies wore uniforms there already, and he did not say the word comfort, because the ocean would have mocked it. He counted them without making a parade of it, 6 souls and a 7th who wanted to be one still. "On my hand," he said, and when he raised it, he felt like he was placing bread on a tongue. They went. In WN-62, the periscope gave Lukas a corridor of sight that narrowed at the moment he needed to see more. He called targets with the practiced meanness of a man who knows how to save ammunition. He was surprised to learn that meanness was useful. He experienced a brief flash of admiration for the men who ran in pairs through a slot he had been sure would eat them. He shut it down. Admiration is a sin in a booth like this. He fed the belt and considered the moment when his brother had lifted him onto the lowest branch of the orchard's left-hand tree and told him not to be afraid of height. He did not consider that memory treason. He made it a handhold. The destroyers fenced with geometry. USS McCook and USS Doyle and others came in until the shallow water looked like the expression a map makes when it is being misread on purpose. Gunnery officers used churches and chimneys for landmarks and put rounds into throttle houses and embrasures with the obsessive care that keeps men from going mad. A shell knocked the face off a pillbox and replaced it with smoke. Tom took the gift. He ran, bent his breath, a stitched seam. The Bangalore went with him like a dog that had finally decided to obey. He pushed it under the lowest strand again lit and turned himself into not there. The blast was a punctuation mark the beach learned to read. Men rose moved, fell rose again in the rhythm of sentences written by wind and luck. A ranger sergeant with a scruffy voice arrived where he had not been sent because the water had stolen his original destination, and he brought with him a sentence that had been waiting for a day to where rangers lead the way. It sounded like bluster until he crawled forward and made a step in dirt where there had been a slope that only goats loved. He wedged his boots into roots and taught the hill a new verb be climbed. Claire found two paratroopers who had arrived the wrong side of the beach and the right side of her heart. One spoke French like a pen pal. The other spoke with hands that looked made for baseball games that had not yet been invented in this village. She led them through a path that had been a cow's preference and now became a military road for three. The draw the French-speaking one asked. "You'll have friends there," she said, and did not promise which kind. Tom met the shingles step and took his men into a slot cut by water and hoof and time. The chalk was crumbly, but accepted weight when asked politely. He put his boot where the ranger had. He thought of the phrase Fortress Europe, and how fortress was a kind lie told by men who had never been in a kitchen where the door sticks unless you lift while you turn. He put his shoulder into the bluff the way you fix a stubborn latch. Above, the chaplain arrived with his 6-knot soldiers and a tone that made them into ones. He said nothing. Saying nothing felt like prayer upgraded to action. Lukas felt the bunker tremble the way a man without a coat feels a wind's promise. He reached for a fresh belt and found the box lighter than he had hoped. There was always another box until the day the next one did not arrive. He turned the periscope and saw a shape he understood only because he had read about it in old novels, a man in a helmet holding a tube of pipe and wire the Bangalore. He fired. The periscope froze when the smoke rose to meet it. He shifted right and picked up a different moving sentence, a man with a wire cutter, and a grin that should have been illegal under Articles of War against Hope. Father Malloy crawled through the open gap like a man visiting a tabernacle. He found 3 boys ahead of him and touched each on the ankle to make their hearts behave. He thought of a day in seminary when some professor had split hairs over the difference between grace and mercy. Here on this sand, grace was an accident that leaned your way, and mercy was a hand pulling when your legs forgot. He would argue for mercy for the rest of his life, if allowed. Joe, looking back from a distance he had not wanted, saw the destroyers beach their guns with a kind of sailor's gallantry. He whistled the little boatswain's whistle in his life jacket, and heard it for the first time since training had made it into a joke. The sound was thin and bright and stupid and everything. He remembered a day he had walked his sister to school and made her laugh by tripping on a root on purpose. He told the ocean, which is a poor listener, that he would bring in one more boat if given the chance. The ocean gave him half a chance, and he took it. The first men crested the bluff, not like victors, but like burglars surprised to find the window open. They crawled through broom and grass and a litter of spent shells. They saw behind the positions the little zigzag trenches, the ammunition crates the color of weathered saplings, the photographs pinned inside the tin cups, and a spoon with a soldier's initial chased into the handle. Tom saw a kettle black with soot, and laughed once because kettles follow him where he does not expect them. He looked down and saw the beach writing a different grammar men, moving forward without the permission of maps. Lukas crouched behind the blocky shape that had been his workroom, heard German he had not learned in school. Panic slurs syllables into each other. He knew this. He got his last belt on, and then his hands refused their conspiracy with the rest of him. He saw at the edge of his sight an American helmet rise where only birds had been. He lifted his rifle because that is what men lifted here. He did not fire because some days a body chooses not to obey the worst sentences it has memorized. Tom found the top and did what men do when they arrive in places their training had not promised. He looked for what would keep them there. He waved men left and right as if he were parking cars in a field for a wedding that had scheduled the wind to be kind. He found a footpath that promised the Vierville road and sent 2 riflemen to see if it would keep its word. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like an exhausted carpenter trying to make a door hang straight on a house that had decided to lean. At mid-afternoon, the beach became a sketch of a port. Bulldozers had crawled ashore with a patience only Diesel understands. Sailors and engineers hammered stakes into a place that had not asked for a pier and began to feed the shore to itself in organized bites. Men up wounded back ammunition, forward news both ways. The tide gave back what it had taken in the morning and then asked again. Corpsmen learned to work with water in their shoes. Language simplified itself up Outbring Hold. Omaha grudgingly began to be a road. Claire's village learned to rehearse welcome. Women with faces that had learned not to show themselves peeked around door frames and decided on tea. A child delivered a pail of milk to a soldier and ran away when he said, "Merci," because sometimes the sound of your own language in an enemy's mouth is too much for a decade to bear. Claire found Father Malloy sitting on a stone with his head back against a wall as if he were surrendering his neck to the sun. "Pear?" she asked, offering the word she had. He smiled a tired agreement and asked for water, and she brought it in a chipped cup that had belonged to the cafe's idea of a good morning. He blessed it out of habit and a little for show and drank it in one grateful sin. Up on the bluffs, pockets of German resistance attempted to improvise, then attempted to retreat, then attempted to pretend they had never been here. Some succeeded. Many did not. Lukas gathered the remnants of his section and led them along a trench that had been dug in the belief that trenches always lead somewhere. It led to a tangle of bushes and a drop that invited ankles to reconsider. He held up a hand, and it meant halt. He adjusted the strap of his rifle, and it meant go. He felt both leave him the way blood leaves a cut if you don't hold pressure on it. He sat in the grass and stared at the cartridge in his palm as if it contained a choice it didn't. Tom kept moving because movement had the decency to feel like purpose. He found himself explaining to a lieutenant what his men had done and discovered he did not care whether the lieutenant wrote it in a notebook. He learned the name of the ranger who had taught the bluff to be a staircase, then forgot it and felt guilty, then remembered that names are a currency war spends fast. He saw a boy from his Bangalore team eating an apple that must have been the worst apple in France and loved him for trying. Joe ran his LCVP in until the prop kissed sand and said, "That's all." He dropped his last ramp of the day with a tenderness that surprised him. He watched men go where other men had gone and imagined he could see their thoughts like smoke. The simple ones, left right now, and the heavy ones, Mother God, what if... He backed the boat out with the throttle low, not daring to throw a rooster tail over the men he had delivered. He looked to the destroyers and saluted, because etiquette is what you keep when everything else is negotiable. Father Malloy found a young German with a stomach wound, trying to hold himself together with his hands. He had the face of a boy who had wanted to prove something to a man he loved. Malloy pushed the hands away gently with a competence born of corrugated mornings and told the boy a truth that felt like a lie, because it was so old. "You're not alone." The boy answered in German that sounded like prayer and apology and the phrase for my brother. Malloy held his head until the jaw went slack and the eyes did that unkind, airy thing. He crossed him anyway and felt no treason in it. Claire reached the crest, where the bunker mouths looked squat and sullen, and found a kettle, black with soot, sitting as if abandoned mid-thought. She laughed because life insists on scents in the wrong places. She lifted it, and the weight told her there would be enough for two. She had carried heavier in winter. She set it on a little brazier and fed it a few strands of broom. And when it steamed, she thought of the cafe and how steam had always meant yes. Two Americans arrived with a caution that respected bushes. She handed them the kettle and made the universal gesture of burned tongues. They understood and pretended they were not thirsty. Lukas decided to stop being a noun and become a verb that required fewer bullets. He led his men toward a gully that promised the road to Formigny. Half left, half right, he said, and it meant nothing and everything. He had become a man whose words required only the politeness of being heard. At the gully's lip, he saw a sign turned the wrong way and understood in a small, bitter joy that the country itself had conspired. He laughed once, and it sounded like a cough. He put his hands up because hands communicate in every language, and he had run out of adjectives. Tom marked the draws with panels the color of fresh carrot, so that the men on the beach and the men at sea could agree where to shove the world through. He found a corporal from the 1st Division who had started the morning at Dog Green and now was here by accident and competence. They shook hands the way men do when handshakes weigh as much as rifles. Thought they said easy beach, the corporal said. That must be next door, Tom said, and both of them surprised themselves by laughing. By late afternoon, trucks began to bump over the shingle with a determination that taught the shingle manners. Engineers pushed fascines into craters to teach holes how to be rowed. A kind of commerce resumed water to men to bluffs to inland. Far behind the destroyers adjusted their ranges and kept scoring old debts on new ledgers. One more gun silent, one more door open. The sky, which had been sullen and practical, decided to show a little blue where smoke had lifted. A gull with bad timing tried to be a motif and was told by everyone to try again tomorrow. Father Malloy stood by the first sign that could be called a headquarters, a table, that had learned to be a desk and gave the chaplain next to him a roll of names. "These will keep me awake," he said. "You sleep, I'll keep them for you." The other man answered, and both knew the lie and loved it for volunteering. Claire watched them and understood that nations meet like this over kettles and notebooks and hands that refused to be empty. Joe rowed the last run of his day, with the wheel light and the boat heavy with the living who needed hands and the dead who needed dignity. He backed out and turned the bow toward ships that had begun to look like buildings painting themselves. He looked back once, not aloud, but discipline had spent itself honestly, and saw a beach that resembled a road and decided that was enough for a calendar to be changed by. Vierville. By evening, Omaha wore bandages. The shingle glittered, not with water, but with the dull usefulness of materials that had found their purpose: stakes with burlap windbreaks, signal panels, tarps that had learned to be roofs, stretchers stacked like planks. The wounded were a bureaucracy of breaths. The dead were the only neat thing on the beach. The living learned to walk without apology across a place that had asked for it all day. Tom moved among the lanes he had helped carve and felt a fatigue that occupied him the way a city occupies a map, completely with room to spare. He remembered a hardware store with wooden bins and a smell of twine. He planned with the extravagance of a man who believes in tomorrow to quit cigarettes and sawdust for a living. He would build doors, he told himself. He would check their swing twice. He would leave a pencil mark on the jamb when he got it right. He would not tell anyone that the pencil mark meant Omaha. He would let it be his private measure of plumb. He found the boy who had laid the first fuse with him and gave him half the Hershey bar he had not dared to eat. It tasted like a bedtime story told to men who had not slept since other men decided on their behalf what a continent should look like. The boy swallowed and asked a question about the ranger with the new sentence, And Tom answered like an uncle who had just seen a nephew do something foolish and brave. Somebody had to say it, he said. Somebody had to make it true. Father Malloy wrote letters with a careful pen in a hand that had learned to be priest and clerk and friend. He wrote the same sentence in 30 different ways so it would be exact for each mother he was not alone. He described sky in 2 cases, water, honestly men with reverence, death with a kind of strict kindness. He did not lie. He chose his nouns like doctors choose instruments, with an awareness that sharpness and gentleness have the same edge depending on where you put them. He signed Father J. Malloy, and then he sat and let the sea say the few true things it remembers, to say that it will go and return, and that the sound you think is rage is sometimes just the world being busy. Claire walked the Vierville road with a basket on her arm that she had promised her mother she would bring back by dark, and did because some promises were older than armies. She saw a jeep, the smallest museum of a nation she had ever considered rattle by, with 2 men who waved as if they were neighbors she had not yet met. She waved back and felt the absurd justice of that gesture. The country doing a thing as important as invasion still must teach the hand to be friendly. Lukas sat in a prisoner cage that looked like a fence unfinished. He clasped his hands because there was nothing else to do with them. He watched the men who watched him and decided they were tired in a way that did not make room for cruelty. He decided this because he needed to. He thought of the orchard and of the first bite of an apple you were told to leave for later and took anyway because hunger is a law with ragged edges. He closed his eyes and saw the periscope's green circle, then saw it become a ring on a table around a cup. He opened them again, and the beach had made itself a port. The destroyers eased themselves out satisfied, like men backing away from a door they had just shouldered open for a friend. They had come in too close and been rewarded by living. The crews cleaned the guns, as if the guns could feel shame. A sailor looked at his hands and saw a blackness that would never quite come out, and smiled because that too was a kind of remembering. Night settled without asking for permission. Flares made a bad day briefly festive. Parachute silk pretended to be lanterns at a dance no one had time to attend. Engineers drove stakes into sand that had agreed to host history. Medics whispered numbers that meant vials and doses and nights of watching. Riflemen slept with boots on because they wanted to be forgiven for any delay. The chaplains traded their last clean words. The ocean turned and pretended it had done nothing unusual. Tom found a spot behind the spoil of a bulldozer's bite and lay on his back and let his eyes discover stars he had not earned. He thought of a door at the back of his father's shop that stuck in winter and then in spring swung true with one honest planing. He thought of a house he had not yet built. He decided that if he survived the hedgerows, he would build it somewhere with a porch that faced a road. He would not paint the front step. He would let it show the scuff of arriving. Father Malloy sat with Claire and a kettle that had made itself into a sacrament. He taught her the word for steam in English steam, and she said vapeur, and they both nodded, as if they were agreeing to something reasonable. He asked her what the sign at the draw had said yesterday, and she told him it had said the wrong thing on purpose. He laughed because purpose had been thin today. He blessed the water again for the pleasure of saying words that had nothing to do with orders and everything to do with gratitude. Joe slept for 20 minutes in the bow of his boat, with the whistle in his hand. He dreamed of a flat ocean that did what it was told. He woke because a seagull argued with a piece of paper on the beach, and he felt anger at the bird so pure he cried again, then laughed at himself, then wiped his face with the same sleeve and looked around to see if anyone had witnessed this foolishness. No one had because everyone was busy with their own foolishnesses, which is how nations get their work done. Lukas lay on his side and tried to think of grammar. He had been a good student once. He knew the difference between transitive and intransitive. He tried to decide whether the day's main verb open took an object or only made space where there had been none. He decided both could be true. He decided he did not hate the men on the other side of the wire because hatred required a specificity he no longer had budget for. He decided to sleep and let the ocean do his thinking. Omaha opened like this, not with a key turned all at once, but with a handful of teeth pressed into a stubborn lock until the pins decided to be reasonable. A Bangalore snaked under wire. A destroyer put its shoulder in close. A chaplain raised his hand, and men moved because a hand can be a flag when flags are afraid. A girl turned a sign and carried a kettle. A coxswain aimed steel at sand and refused to panic the dignity of speed. A German did not pull a trigger he could have. The beach learned to be a road. The road learned to be a country. And the country remembered its old promise that doors exist to be open, and that some doors are beaches and require the courage of many at once. In the weeks that followed, hedgerows would teach new lessons about patience and range. Towns would join the grammar, Essigny, Saint-Lô, Saint-Mère-Église, names that would mean nothing to some and everything to others. Paris would rehearse her own opening. The war would not end because a beach had learned to be a door, but the continent had felt the latch shift. Fortress Europe discovered that fortresses are only houses that forgot they were built by hands. And one day when men wrote calendars, they would circle this date and argue about numbers and maps and tonnage and toneless words like attrition. Some of them would remember a kettle, a whistle, a periscope's green ring, a white tape on a hedgehog, a Hershey bar shared in salt, and admit that these two were instruments that played the hinge. On a porch, years later, because men who live build porches, Tom would sit with a door he had hung himself and listen to the evening rehearsing the sounds that made him believe in ordinary days. He would rub the pencil mark on the jam with his thumb and not explain it to his daughter. He would tell her instead about the kindness of a destroyer that came in too close, and the bravery of a priest who spoke in verbs, and the luck of a boat that kissed sand at the right angle, and the truth that a fortress is only an overconfident house. He would not say Omaha, but he would mean it with every breath. And when she asked how a beach opens a continent, he would say with many small keys at once, and with people willing to be each other's door.